Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and thank you to viewers around the world for tuning into today's program, The Future of U.S.-China-Hong Kong Relations and Media Challenges. This webinar was specially designed by EWC Seminars Live and South China Morning Post, and we are grateful to the South China Morning Post for its partnership. My name is Susan Kreifels, and I'm the Media Programs Manager at the East-West Center. It's my pleasure to introduce today's lineup of prominent media professionals from Hong Kong and the United States. We start with Mr. Gary Liu, who is the CEO of South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. Mr. Keith Richburg, who is the Director of the Journalism and Media Studies Centers at the University of Hong Kong and a former Washington Post China correspondent. Ms. Lingling Wei, Senior China Correspondent from the Wall Street Journal, now based in New York City. She was earlier based in Beijing until China expelled Wall Street Journal reporters earlier this year. She is also co-author of Superpower Showdown, how the battle between Trump and Xi threatens a new Cold War. We also have Mr. Robert Delaney, North America Bureau Chief and columnist for the South China Morning Post. He's based in Washington, D.C. He was also a former reporter in China for Dow Jones, Newswires, and Bloomberg. Miss Angie Lau, Editor-in-Chief and CEO and founder of Forecast News in Hong Kong, will be our moderator today. Angie is well known as a former anchor for Bloomberg TV's flagship morning show, First Up with Angie Lau, broadcast globally into 350 million homes, businesses, and trading floors. So I'm going to take a moment today to share our Zoom protocols. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded on Zoom, and will be made available on YouTube for later viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off. This will be an interactive discussion, and Q&A will take place after the speaker's discussion. To submit a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and specify if there's a particular speaker you wish to answer your question. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. So our program starts today with a fireside chat between Gary and Keith, and they're going to talk about media challenges in Hong Kong and the United States. Then they're going to hand over the program to our moderator, Angie, and Lingling and Robert will join the discussion. It will be an interactive discussion. So I'm handing it over to you, Keith and Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I can say good morning to you, Gary. We're in the same time zone, right?
That's right. We're not too far from one another.
Exactly. We've got multiple time zones here, so I'll say good morning to you and good evening to others and good afternoon to people in Hawaii. But how are you doing?
Doing okay. I mean, Hong Kong, of course, as you know, is slowly returning to some level of normalcy after, gosh, at this point, what, 16, 17 months of nonstop change and crisis. Who knows whether or not this is going to last and how long this is going to last, because now all the stories about the fourth wave coming because the weather is getting a little bit colder, I mean, by Hong Kong standards. And of course, people are going back to school, so there's fear of another spike. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and keeping our masks on.
Absolutely. Now, let me ask you now, are you working out of your newsroom these days, or have you been doing work from home like everybody else in the world?
We have been, we are now back in our newsroom. But again, that's sort of a tentative office reopening. We've been effectively work from home as a distributed news organization for the better part of 6 months at this point. There have been moments where we've had 50%, maybe a little bit more of our staff back in the office. This week is the first week that we've really reopened the office properly to our Hong Kong colleagues. But at any point, we could decide to shut it down again and make sure everyone's safe. But definitely personal and social health is of prime importance for our newsroom right now. Absolutely. Well, stay safe. Let's start right in on some of the topics that we wanted to talk about today. And one is the SCMP, who everybody knows, South China Morning Post. That name has been around for many decades here. But tell me, what is SCMP today? Are you guys a local Hong Kong newspaper? Are you guys an international newspaper that just happens to have a big office in Hong Kong? I know you probably have more subscribers outside of Hong Kong than in Hong Kong. So sure. Tell me what is SCMP? Yeah, it's a good starting question. I think the answer depends on who you're talking to and who you're asking. I will tell you from the newspaper's point of view first, and then we can talk about how other people view the Post's value and what part of the conversation around the world that we're leading right now. From the Post point of view, we recognize that we are largely two different products to two different groups of readers. For the city of Hong Kong and our loyal readers here in Hong Kong, we remain, for many of them, the newspaper of record of the city. We have been so for well over a century, and we continue to be headquartered in Hong Kong, and we expect to continue to be headquartered in Hong Kong. And our primary role for our people here in the city is to cover not only the city, not only the city's relationship with Beijing and the rest of China, but also, of course, everything that is of prime importance around the world and how it will affect the citizens of this city. So that's our role. But for the vast majority of our readers now, and at this point, about 92% of our readers on a monthly basis come from outside of Hong Kong, we represent something wholly different, which is that we are a news organization that specializes in reporting on China for the rest of the world. So we are a specialist publication in that sense. And so I think that is largely how we are viewed by our audience, depending on where you come from and what your interests are. You're either reading us for the local perspective and bring the international flavor to Hong Kong, or you're reading us because we are as comprehensive as you're going to find of a news organization reporting on China and its impact on the rest of the world. So you're bringing, yeah, go ahead, Keith. No, you're bringing China to the world, but you're also bringing the world here to Hong Kong as well. That is, yes, that is the dual purpose, although we see it as one and the same. And the way that we operate within our newsroom is that there is no, we don't write a story, any story specifically, and say this is just for Hong Kong readers and this is just for international readers, because we do frankly believe that Hong Kong is extremely important in the global conversation. I mean, the title of this session itself suggests that. Right, that it is not just U.S.-China relations, but U.S.-China-Hong Kong relations, and Hong Kong, in many ways, has been caught in the middle of these two, these two capitals, and I think that what happens to Hong Kong should be important to everyone around the world. That's right. Now, is SCMP or SCMP.com widely read in mainland China? I think you know the answer to that question, but I'm glad that you're asking it. SCMP.com is 100% blocked in mainland China. So we're actually not a well-known brand in mainland China, at least not to the rank and file, not to most of the citizens in mainland China. They just have never read us. They've never had access to us. We don't print there. We don't distribute there. Our website is blocked. Our WeChat accounts don't really work there. So we just don't have distribution in mainland China. But to most of the newsmakers in China, to the academics, to the policy folks, we are a known news organization, and that is to our advantage. We are able to have conversations that many other global news companies cannot in mainland China. Yeah, Keith, that's interesting. Do you mind if I throw a question back at you as well? Please, this is a conversation. Yes, please. Of course, Hong Kong has long been a bastion of not only the free press here in Asia, but also of journalism education, and you run one of the great journalism schools and journalism programs, not only in Asia, but in the world. How do you see the role of Hong Kong HKU journalism now? Has it changed much over the course of the last several years, including because of the protests and how you've been training your students during the protests? Has it changed because of the rise of China, the importance of the Hong Kong, China, US story? What is the role of HKU journalism in your mind at this point?
That's a great question, and kind of like you, I mean, kind of like SCMP being this kind of global newspaper here in Hong Kong, we like to say we're an international journalism school that happens to be based here in Hong Kong. You know, we are, as a journalism school, we're relatively new to the game. There are a couple of other very good journalism schools here. There's Chinese University, which has a school of communications and journalism. There's Baptist University that has a much bigger program than ours. So we only came into the game 20 years ago. We're celebrating, I think this is our 21st class we just started here. And so what we try to do, our kind of niche is international best practices journalism for the international media market. So our graduates go on to work for SCMP, as you know, we send many there, but also Reuters, Bloomberg, CNN, AFP, you name it, the international news agencies, the Washington Post, New York Times, international publications. So we see ourselves as doing several things at once. For mainland Chinese journalists, who are a huge chunk of our master's program, they're coming here to, number one, learn international best practices and standards of journalism. And then for many of them, hopefully break into the international media market. And then for many of our international students who come from really everywhere, United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, Mexico, Russia, you name it, they come here because basically they know that China is such a huge story. And they're really interested in covering Asia, covering China. And they're looking for a journalism school that's based in this part of the world, but also would be teaching international best practices, best standard journalism. And I should have added there all English language too. We only teach English language journalism. So our instructors are very international. We come from the United States, Canada, Australia, India, everywhere, Japan, everywhere. And our students are very international. They come from everywhere as well. So whereas the other schools maybe have a bit more of a pipeline into the local Chinese language media market, I like to think that we kind of are the English language journalism school. So we're kind of in a similar position. We're
great partners in that sense, which leads me to my second question actually for you, Keith. Now, we talk a lot in our newsroom about what it means to have international standards of what quality journalism looks like, but an Asian voice applied to, or at the very least in partnership with those international standards. Now, of course, the Asian voice does not necessarily mean a different perspective, but it does mean, in many ways, a different texture that adds to this global conversation about China's rising impact around the world. And we lean into that. We believe that it is additive to the way the world sees and understands Asia, and the way the world the way the world is able to converse with one another. Now, I want to ask, from an educator's point of view, as you are teaching journalism, and since the majority of your students are from this part of the world, do you talk about that, or is that just inherent? Is that just native to their upbringing, to the way that they see the world because of their background? And is that something that you that is celebrated at HKU journalism, or something that you feel like adds? Well, actually, I'm just going to let you answer the question. How do you think about that quote unquote Asian voice?
Exactly. Well, it's almost like you've seen our old brochures. For many years, our slogan on our brochures we handed out at student fairs was Asian Voices, Global Views. And, that was trying to say, and again, it didn't mean voices only of Asians, because we have a lot of non-Asian students who come here from all over the world, but it was simply by being here in Asia, we're adding that kind of Asian perspective to all kinds of global news coverage. I mean, one of our graduates went on to work for CNN as the Latin American bureau chief, but they got their master's degree here at HKU. So they're working all over the world, but having had that perspective on Asia and China. And but I must say, even though we are very international, the bulk of our students come from this part of the world in terms of, we have students from both undergraduate and graduate students who are not only from mainland China and Hong Kong, but also from Taiwan, South Korea. We have quite a few students from India, Nepal, Southeast Asian countries. We get quite a few from Singapore every year, Indonesia, Myanmar. And so we are seen even in the region here as the school you go to if you want to do kind of English language, international journalism. And that's where our kind of niche is. and we get approached by our international partners, media partners like AFP, Reuters, Bloomberg, et cetera, CNN, because they all still, given the changes in Hong Kong, still have massive bureaus here.
Right.
Asia, Hong Kong, and I think this is kind of why it's interesting both for SCMP and for the HKU journalism. Hong Kong is still a big media hub. Now, people are talking about how that could change, under, the various changes that are going on now, especially since the national security laws come into effect. But, this is still the regional hub, not only for covering China, but geographically, when you're looking at a map, it's central for Southeast Asia as well. Right. It's just such a central location, a central place for media. You guys feel that too, because you guys also cover Southeast Asia. You have this Week in Asia edition.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the hand-wringing around the national security law and what it means for the press in Hong Kong is very real, and it's something that we can't just sweep under the rug. It doesn't matter how optimistic you are about the city, and I happen to be in that camp of folks who are optimistic about the city. You have to talk about it. There are implications. The implications, I think, are going to be longer term and revealing themselves than short term. In fact, I would say that right now, short term, there's been some changes to the way that other people talk to us as sources, but it hasn't really changed the way that we do our journalism. That said, I think we have to recognize that Hong Kong, and by we I mean the industry as a whole, those of us who have are in positions of stewardship of the media in Asia and certainly here in Hong Kong, we have to recognize that it requires proactive protection. That it is something that we have to constantly be working at to make sure that Hong Kong remains, not only for our own news organizations, but for many others, the hub in Asia. And I think that it's not just to the detriment of Hong Kong, but it would be to the detriment of the world if that changes in any way, in any material sense. So Keith, I mean, have perspectives changed for prospective students? Of course, I know that without being able to travel, it's probably changed the way that students either from last year's class or this year's new class interact with you guys as professors and teachers. But has there been a shift in appetite of coming to Hong Kong to see the media space here, to be trained in the city?
Yeah, interestingly, we were really expecting a drop-off in our number of applications and the number of people coming both for our undergraduate program and our master's program, because we thought after all of these months, the protests started in June of last year, if people have forgotten. And people have forgotten that, they became probably the most violent or the most animated around October, right 1 year ago. And I mean, 1 year ago, it's amazing what was going on in the streets of Hong Kong here. You had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, really having these kind of pitched battles with police. So we were really expecting that there was going to be a fall off in applications and a fall off in students coming, both from mainland Chinese students who might be thinking that Hong Kong is just not a hospitable place for them, and students from around the world thinking, wow, Hong Kong is just too dangerous or whatever. As a consequence, we actually got more people. We got more. You've got some drop in applications, but we've got a strong class. We've got our largest incoming freshman undergraduate class than we've ever had in the history of our program. And we've got a really solid master's degree program class too. The only time we had a bit of a drop off is because some people could not physically get here because of flight connections that were disrupted or quarantines in various countries, et cetera. And, we asked all of the students, we interview every one of our students. We're one of the few programs where we actually do a one-on-one interview usually in this Zoom or Skype forum with every student. And we asked them at the beginning of this acceptance process, why did you decide to come to Hong Kong? Or have you been paying attention to what's in the news? And they said, yeah, we wanted to come to Hong Kong because it was in the news. Mm-hmm. We wanted to come to Hong Kong because it seemed like a great time to be there. There's great news going on. It's a fascinating place to go. So that's particularly true of our international students, right. Students who are sitting in the US, sitting in Australia, sitting in Canada, watching this news from Hong Kong and said, that's where I want to go study journalism. And I think, so there hasn't been that kind of a drop off. And in fact, it's been the exact opposite. It's been a bit of a lure.
I love hearing that. I love hearing that. We're seeing the same from a recruiting and hiring standpoint. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated for us because it's really hard to do the kind of journalism that South China Morning Post does remotely from outside of Hong Kong and mainland China. And in fact, that is our advantage, that we are present here. And so even though there has been, from what we've seen, some increased interest from international journalists saying, okay, that is, we know now that we need to go to Hong Kong, we need to report from there, we want to see it in person for X number of years. It's been hard for us to actually activate that, but the interest is certainly there, and that's part of my optimism. I'm so encouraged to hear that people entering into journalism for the first time and those that are tenured in journalism recognize the importance of the city, are not afraid of the implications, and are willing to not only invest their careers and their time, but to actually, to some degree, kind of uproot, sacrifice, whatever it is that you want to call it, and come and join the practice here.
Sure. Well, let me ask you one question, because sure. I mean, one of the big challenges for all media around the world, and I imagine you here too, is the economic challenge, which is probably as big a challenge as the political challenge here. Advertising revenue everywhere has been collapsing as businesses have gone into shutdown, et cetera. I mean, how is number one, how's South China Morning Post doing? And then number two, is there ever going to be a time where you decide, it's not worth printing this paper because everybody's reading it on their devices?
Right. I'll tell you this, the economic business challenges of news, for us at the very least, are far outweigh the quote unquote political challenges. Because the political challenges are things that we are very familiar with, right? The South China Morning Post has always reported, has never reported in a democratic city, has never been based in a democratic city, has never reported on a country that really embraces freedom of press. So it's not, the political challenges, the ebbs and flows of that are not new to this organization. But the business struggles of the last several years are brand new. And of course, the business has been in decline for well over a decade and a half, and that's something that everywhere, our peers around the world have all experienced. The reality for the Post right now is that the last year plus has been the worst financial year for the Post, the most difficult financial year for the Post that anyone can remember. Within the institutional history and knowledge that exists today in our company, no one can remember a 15-month period like the last 15 months for us. But we continue to fight through it, right? What it has done is accelerated our view of what diversification of revenue and what the future business really looks like. The question, Keith, is not whether or not we're going to stop printing the print newspaper, because first of all, the print newspaper is only printed here in Hong Kong, and it is funded by print advertising, which, believe it or not, still makes quite a bit of money. So the print newspaper itself is highly profitable. The part that is not profitable is our digital distribution, because the economics of digital news have not caught up to the reality of value and of the cost of creation. So that is what we have to reinvent, regardless of whether or not we print the newspaper, which the short answer is we expect to continue to print the newspaper for a long time, because it serves Hong Kong, it serves a very specific purpose. But we have to reinvent as an entire industry, right? Not just as a newspaper, but as an industry, we have to reinvent what the economics for our digital distribution looks like, which is why digital subscription and reader revenue, literally exchanging value directly with our readers, is so important long term.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have to transition in just a minute. So we just have a minute for a question, which I was actually always been curious about, which is, we've seen with the last 16 or 18 months or however long these protests have been going on, this city has become very polarized, incredibly polarized. And the media has often reflected that. And I see South China Morning Post trying to kind of thread the needle and kind of stay right in that center zone. But how difficult is that when the city is kind of splitting apart into two factions?
Well, it's difficult insofar as there are more complaints and insults thrown at us from both sides, right? And so as long as we are a news organization that stands in strong conviction, it doesn't make our operation any more difficult. We just have to, in some ways, block out the noise. Now, of course, the caveat is that it's important not to fully block out the noise. If you put on noise canceling headphones, you might lose sight of where objectivity really lies. It is important, and our editors do an incredible job of the hard job of wading through the comments and reading all of the reader emails that come in and understand the perspectives from multiple sides, so that we can always calibrate and recognize what objectivity ought to look like. They do the hard job. We have to train our journalists, especially the young journalists, of what it means to report objectively. And thank goodness we have educators like you in the city and around the world that are helping us do that. so we're not retraining everyone when they come into our newsroom for the first time. But we think it's extremely important. Certainly not under my watch or the watch of the current editorial masthead. You should not expect that to change for the Post. And I think that, yes, it is more important today than it's ever been before.
Well, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's so important too that this debate is going on in newsrooms all over the world. In the United States, with the Black Lives Matter movement, they're now talking about, you know, how much objectivity is still a trusted value. We expect journalists to be out there tweeting. You know, I think this is a great time to kind of open it up to the broader, the panel here that's going to be discussing this. I hope people bring up this whole question of objectivity, and is it an outdated value? You know, I feel like I'm a dinosaur sometimes, teaching people to stay objective and in that lane. I can't think of anybody better to have this conversation monitored by or led by than Angie Lau. Is Angie in the room now and ready to take the baton over for our open panel?
Hi, Keith. I'm right here. Thank you so much for that. Yes, we've been monitoring, observing, listening in, and we're about to jump in. And Gary and Keith, thank you so much for that very candid conversation. We're going to get even more candid, and I want to welcome now Ling Wei and Robert Delaney from the US side. And Robert, just unmute, and Gary unmute. And so we're all going to be unmuted, which is a good thing when we are talking about, with journalists. But, you know, I joke, and yet, you know, the irony is that the concern is that we are being muted, that the new national security law, and let's just dive right in, kind of puts a cloud of concern and fear. The language is very vague. It has been widely reported that the language that includes succession and, well, let me just read it out here. Succession, this is the language, subversion, terrorism, collusion with foreign forces, is not only encompassing for Hong Kong, but literally anyone on this planet who could run afoul of this law. Where does this leave journalists trying to do journalism in this region? Robert, Ling, I'll have you guys start and have Keith and Gary weigh in as well. Actually, why don't we start with Ling? You were kicked out of China as part of the tit for tat that we've been increasingly seeing politically. As you saw what was happening in Hong Kong, and as you have personally and professionally experienced the concern about being muted, the concern about doing the job of journalism in the region, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, Angie, for having me here. Geez, I wish I had any good advice to give, but all I have to say right now is I'm feeling for all my colleagues and competitors who are in Hong Kong, still trying to do their job on a daily basis. And the risk, as you just laid out earlier, Angie, is enormous, right? Basically, they're putting their own personal well-being and at risk, and sometimes who knows how this law, this national security law in Hong Kong would really be implemented. The government has been saying that only a few people, would be punished if, for all the crimes you're citing just now. But on the other hand, hardly a week goes by without you seeing some, activists, protesters, most recently, the very well-known media tycoon, Jimmy Lai, all got rounded up, all citing in violation with the new law. You really, really do not know how, harshly or, in any kind of limited way, this law would be implemented. So that's a huge uncertainty. And I know for a fact that a lot of foreign correspondents based in China, based in Hong Kong these days, are having difficulty in terms of getting their visas, their permits renewed. And that's exactly the same thing all those foreign correspondents in China have experienced for years. The situation obviously got dramatically worse in recent months because of the worsening of bilateral relationship between the US and China. I was among the scores of American journalists getting kicked out of kicked out of China. So, but up until recently, Hong Kong had remained a place where you can still practice independent journalism without fearing any kind of retribution from the government. But now it seems like that is changing. The Chinese government, the central government, has made it very clear that one country system simply doesn't apply. At least when it comes to journalism, it's one country, one system. What has been going on in Beijing is now being transported to Hong Kong. I just, because I experienced what I experienced the past 6 months or so, I felt like it's the longest period of time in my life. It's a lot of emotional ups and downs, and it really broke my heart to have to leave my family, my dream job, which always have been covering China, out of China for the Wall Street Journal. But it was really a hard choice, having to leave and pack up and coming back to New York. I think a lot of my colleagues and my peers and my competitors in Hong Kong would have to face the same kind of choice. And just all I can say is just follow your heart, follow what you really, really believe in. If this is what you believe in, just tough it out. If there are any other reason that make you think twice, and don't feel bad about it, because after all, your livelihood, your family is what matter the most.
Yeah. Amen to that. I mean, Robert, you're covering this story, but stateside in the U.S., and you're close to the story, but obviously under the protection of the United States, where press freedoms is entrenched in the Constitution. But do you feel the cloud looming in your work? Do you, obviously with direct ties to Hong Kong, with your colleagues, and even experiencing amongst the press corps there as you report on the administration, how are you, from your perspective, what's the feeling of the national security law on journalism?
Well, I mean, I guess I should say that the national security law has changed nothing about the way that I operate and the way that all my colleagues operate here in the US. I mean, we're a fairly small team, but we, I would say that and obviously we're covering a lot of the reaction within the US government and in Congress to the national security law. So there have been, that's been sort of amplified in various pieces of legislation that seek to change the Hong Kong government's or the Chinese government's mind about what's going on. But I would say that the biggest impact on me has really been the questions that I get. I mean, I get it very often when news broke that this national security law was going to be passed. I think there was, I had a lot of conversations with sources that I speak to quite often in Washington, asking me, well, what are you going to do? How have you seen it affected you yet? And I mean, I just have to say quite honestly that it absolutely doesn't affect anything in our work. Now, obviously, as you point out, I'm in the US, I'm in a very different environment. So it's hard for me to speak to how much of an effect this is having for either my colleagues on the ground in Hong Kong or other journalists on the ground in Hong Kong. I feel like we're so focused on, there's such a bewildering rush of developments that happen in terms of the way that the U.S. government is dealing with the Chinese government now and with the Hong Kong government, that it's almost like, yes, okay, I'm aware that the national security law has been passed, but unless we're writing up a story that's about a new piece of legislation that Congress is trying to pass in reaction to that, unless we're focused on that specifically, it just doesn't enter my world. And as for I also get the question about the extraterritoriality of the legislation, and am I concerned about that? And it's very simple. No, I don't change anything about that. I don't worry about that at all.
Gary, you must. What are the conversations sometimes on the, when you're in your office and then you get the knock on the door? I wonder how many of those conversations, and if you could share, maybe anonymously, what the concerns might be even in your newsroom, or maybe these are very broad conversations. I know that you're an incredible leader at SCMP. I've seen you field your town halls. How have the conversations been, and how have you been directing your troops from a leadership position?
Yes, it's complicated, but I think what's most important is that we have to separate three different things. The first is the anxiety, consternation that journalists in Hong Kong are feeling, which is very real. The second is what could be possible because of the national security law long-term in the city. And then the third is the reality of the present here in Hong Kong, whether or not it's actually already started to change things. Let me take each of them one by one. The anxiety and consternation, as I said, is real. And so we do have a lot of conversations about what it means for the operation of the South China Morning Post. We've always been based here. We have absolutely no plans whatsoever of leaving Hong Kong and moving our headquarters. We frankly could not continue to do what we do anywhere but Hong Kong. And we have 40% of our newsroom in Hong Kong are expatriates, right? Are not from Hong Kong. And so a lot of people, to Ling Ling's point, are wondering about the visas, and there really was a slowdown on visa renewal. Now, during that time when initially the national security law came along and SCMP was reacting to it, and no one really knew what was going to happen with it and whether or not it was going to immediately change Hong Kong, there were a lot of folks wondering whether or not they should pack up and quote unquote go home. And a lot of our local journalists were wondering whether or not they have a future in this industry. And those conversations, they happened, they should have happened. There's no fault that anyone felt that way. But the focus for our organization was on making sure that our operation did not change. The biggest issue with the national security law today in Hong Kong, I'm jumping a little bit to that third thing now, is self-censorship. And it would be self-censorship in our own newsroom if it does happen. But more importantly, we have to recognize that many of our sources are pausing for a minute and thinking before they speak, or deciding not to speak at all. And that is the biggest threat to journalism in Hong Kong right now. Not the practice of journalism itself, but rather what people are willing to say to us. So our ability to very quickly and very transparently get to the truth, okay? So the conversation in our newsroom with all this anxiety around our staff was focused on, okay, we understand that you're worried, but until we know for sure that something's going to change, operate as is, and here are the steps that you must take to ensure that the conviction of journalism for the South China Morning Post remains stable and steady, right? Now, one thing I do have to note is that over the course of just the last couple of weeks, now that the civil service has returned back to the office, we have seen those journalism visas renewed. So there has been a positive shift. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that there hasn't been extra diligence paid by the government to journalist visas. I don't know either way, but I can tell you that now that the civil service is back, and that was always the reason the government gave us, was that, oh, the civil service is out of the office. Hong Kong operates in a very, very slow way with a lot of paper and a lot of actual stamps and whatnot. And so the visas are actually being renewed now, which is highly encouraging to us and to our people. That's the first thing. The second, and I'll move through this really quickly. The second is what the national security law could mean to Hong Kong. And I think that this is where the global press, in their in their kind of somewhat dystopic covering of the national security law are correct. If we really draw the line of logic between the word of the letter of the law to what it could actually mean for Hong Kong, if the way that it's written is actually applied long term, it does mean that Hong Kong is going to inevitably change to a city that most of us do not recognize, into a city where the freedom of press that is so important to this part of the world and this city itself will be unrecognizable, could become unrecognizable. But the reality of the present is not that. And what people forget about Hong Kong, and a lot of people who don't really understand Hong Kong, is that they don't pay attention to the judiciary. And that is, that is a final gate for the freedom of press. And so far, we have been encouraged by the way that the judiciary has responded to, has openly advocated for, and continues to speak about the protection of the basic freedoms, including the freedom of expression and freedom of press. And so I think that the implications of the national security law will take months, if not years, to slowly actually parse out. And in that period of time, the operation of major news organizations, including ours, the operation of journalism schools, including Keats, will not change. I mean, as long as we're here, it will not change. And so, as I said at the start of the program, I'm optimistic about Hong Kong because I'm optimistic about the judiciary. I'm optimistic that a lot of the things that Ling Ling says about the city, although they are real fears, are not going to come to pass, certainly not in the short to midterm. And we'll continue to be able to report the way that we do today.
That conviction is so critical to journalism, and it should and must, in my view, and in all our views, be enforced by the environment in which we practice it. Despite our conviction, if that support is not there, there is inevitably going to be an erosion of that conviction. Keith, I've got to applaud those journalism students that saw the opportunity to come into a very volatile environment of Hong Kong, seeing the opportunities to do those stories and signing up and trying to learn how to do great journalism under your tutelage and at JMSC rather.
HKU journalism.
HKU journalism. But unfortunately, they cannot practice the kind of journalism that they could have practiced even a scant few months ago. We have seen the press badges being retracted, that only specific organizations will be accredited and identified, that if others are on the street, even if they are students, and I've seen some of the great work that your students actually did during some of those volatile moments that Hong Kong experienced, they're going to face, they will not be legally protected. How have you shifted or tried to coach or teach as these young people who were so thrilled to be able to be here are now under a different set of rules?
Well, exactly. It's a different set of rules. And the short answer is, my message to the incoming students in September was full steam ahead. Nothing changes for us. We're going to keep doing what we do until somebody comes and tells us to stop. And they have not done that yet, I should add. Look, I mean, the longer version of that is, when the national security came down, the national security law came down like a hammer. I mean, it's so amazing how fast this came. It didn't exist June 29th, and by July 1st, we awakened to a new reality here. But I think journalists, including journalism students, all of us kind of went through the local Hong Kong version of the many stages of grief. I mean, first it was denial. Oh, no, this can't be the real. Then it was kind of like anger. How could they possibly do this? And then it was kind of like, grieving. Oh my God, this is impossible. Hong Kong's over. But I think that final stage that we're in now is just get up, have your coffee in the morning and go off and do the job. Just a quick digression. I was able to speak during an Asian American Journalism Association, AAJA, Asia conference with our good friend Maria Ressa from the Philippines. She has been hammered with I don't know how many court cases. She's looking at long periods of time in jail. Her right to travel was restricted. And I asked her the question, how is your Rappler newsroom holding up with all this kind of assault going on? And she said, they go in every day and they do their job. Don't let this all distract you from doing your job. And I guess for me, partly it's having worked around Asia, having worked around Southeast Asia, having worked in China, even having worked in Africa. I mean, even with the worst that could happen under the national security law, you can still do good journalism. Your good journalism is still happening in places where there are monumental restrictions on what journalists can do. So that's what I meant by you got to go through these stages of grief, where if journalists go sitting back and say, oh, but we used to be able to do this, or it used to be so easy to go talk to sources and now we can't talk to them, or it used to be so easy to cover police protests and now they're trying to restrict the, stop thinking about the way it used to be. That's gone. But just start figuring out, look, we can still do great journalism. There's still great journalism coming out of China itself under great restrictions. Every country I've covered in Southeast Asia has some heavy restrictions. In Thailand, it's lèse-majesté laws and very strict laws on criminal defamation. In Indonesia and Malaysia, it's blasphemy laws. In Myanmar, journalists have gone to jail and won prizes. The Reuters journalists have gone to jail for uncovering what happened with the Rohingya. Get out there and do the job. And, I remember the old line from that movie, The Post, where they were wondering about whether to cover the Pentagon Papers. And Ben Bradley says, look, the way to protect your right to publish is to publish. The way to protect your right to do good journalism is to get out there and just keep doing good journalism. Now, obviously, some people may not feel that they want to take that risk, et cetera. That's a personal decision. People never know what their risk profile is. But as I mentioned, for students, I say, don't worry about the consequences. Just get out there and cover the stories until somebody tells you not to. And so that's what I just try to impart to students. I'm really glad to see that they take that message to heart. And I kind of agree with what Gary said. The biggest danger under the national security law at the moment are not the red lines in the law, it's the red lines in your own head as a journalist. So if you start saying, oh, I don't want to write about that, it's too sensitive, or this might be too sensitive, then you're doing the job of the national security law. So my attitude is get out there, cover the stories. Somebody will tap you on the shoulder and if they think you're going too far.
I'll quote Charles Dickens, a classic, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times for journalists. That is absolutely true. It is just the nature of the times. It is the nature of news. It is ever changing. But suddenly journalists are finding themselves in the crosshairs. As US-China Hong Kong relations erode and seemingly disintegrate as each day passes, journalists, as Ling Ling will attest to, have become part of the cannon fodder, part of the weaponry. Where do you see yourselves, in this generation of journalists to still try to do the job of journalism? As it takes on a political light, one man's activist is another man's propagandist. I'll just leave it at that. And for you, Robert, I want to start off with you. As you're doing your work there, we're seeing it firsthand, we're hearing about it. The language, the rhetoric has very much intensified. How do you deal with that kind of erosion?
You're asking specifically about the deterioration of US-China relations. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. And the implications on conducting yourself as a journalist.
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's a matter of keeping in mind what's at stake. You're talking about the world's two largest economies. So for me, I always have to remind myself of that going into a story, how important it is to get the facts as accurate as I can. And I think the SCMP's mission has always been to try to be as objective as possible, to present both sides of the story. And I guess it's difficult to do that when we're always sort of recalibrating, you know what I mean? So it was, when I started with the SENP in the US, it was about 3.5 years ago, there was a lot of rhetoric, but the trade war had not started yet. But then eventually the trade war did start, and it seemed like, okay, well, 25% or whatever they started at, 25% tariffs or one thing, and then or 10%, and then they went up, and then there's this tranche of commodities, and then this tranche, and started to grow. But then, of course, it got even more strident. I think as politicians realized that that there was political gains to be made in trying to demonize China, the rhetoric escalated. And then I think it all played off of each other on this side. So I think how I deal with it is to sort of just take it back to, again, take it back to remind when we're writing stories about what's happening, to try and give readers a sense of how important it is, how important this relationship is, and how much both sides have to lose if this continues.
I want to know, for all of you, have you been able to get access to the kind of facts, data, and sources still? Or do you think there's been increased scrutiny as to what's your organization? Oh, yeah, I don't really want to talk to you. We've seen that even in the White House press corps. I'm just wondering, Robert and Ling, as you continue to practice journalism, are you sensing that your access to sources are starting to take on a different color because of perception of the region?
Sure. So when it comes to access in terms of to government officials, decision makers in China, it has always been a problem for us. But obviously the trade war, the new Cold War between the US, China has made it worse because, day in, day out in China these days, state media would totally be pouncing on American press, basically, especially the Wall Street Journal. Earlier this year, we actually had 3 reporters expelled from China because of the headline of an editorial they had nothing to do with. Definitely, in terms of the reputation, image the Wall Street Journal traditionally has enjoyed in China is this credible news organization. Definitely, the recent rhetoric certainly, really hurt that. In terms of you mentioned earlier about because the relationship has changed so dramatically, and I personally was sort of, collateral damage of this whole worsening relationship. I remember right after I came back to New York, one of the first questions one of my peers asked me was, you got expelled from China, you continue to write about China. Would your personal experience or your personal feelings, color your coverage of China? And my answer was absolutely not. Years of Wall Street Journal training really, has made us very, this is a very hard to shake belief in us these days. We only are responsible to our readers, right? Our responsibility is to hold the powerful accountable. That's always our stated mission. And I continue to write, deep dive kind of stories about China. Definitely wouldn't allow my personal experience, color my coverage. If anything, I think my personal experience really helped me, understand the situation better, especially in terms of the human toll from the worsening of the relationship. Because past 3 years, when I was covering the trade war day in, day out with my partner in Washington, Bob Davis, we were writing about the impact on businesses, on Washington, on Beijing. But now it's it's trickling down to individuals, especially those who straddle both countries. You know, there are a lot of Chinese Americans, you know, also Americans living in China, Chinese living in America. So that's, you know, how what I experienced is what they are experiencing right now. So it actually what my experience helped me really understand the situation better and what really is at stake. So I do think, you know, it's really a very tough situation these days for all of us journalists to navigate, be you in China, in Hong Kong, in US, covering either Washington or Beijing. There's lots of pressure, heightened hurdles, huge challenges, but you know what, you know, we're used to that, right? That's why we're interested in this job. It's hugely challenging, but at the same time, incredibly rewarding.
Incredibly rewarding during these very dangerous times. So I gotta open this up to our audience here. They've been chomping at the bits. Of course, many joining are, of course, journalists. So you have all of your questions. So I'm going to transition right now to the Q&A portion from our audience. I'll be fielding the Q&As that you present in the Q&A box on the Zoom panel. Of course, many of you have also pre-submitted some questions, and I'll be sharing some of those questions with our panelists. I might pepper some of my own in here, but this was pre-submitted as our registrants came through. You now count in the north of 400, close to 5. So it's great to see this interest here. For Gary and Keith, you're both, you know, you're just entrenched in the fabric of what journalism in Hong Kong means. This is a question I think for the both of you. Of course, Ling, Robert, weigh in as well. Hong Kong historically has been an important regional media center for China watchers and other journalists. Is there any evidence that Hong Kong is losing its appeal as a base for foreign media? And if so, where are these foreign news bureaus relocating in the Asian region?
I can jump in. You know, we sit at times comfortably, at times uncomfortably in between local media here in Hong Kong and the foreign media, because we are English language, and certainly in the way that we operate in mainland China, we are that status kind of changes based on, to some degree, convenience, and based on you know, how Beijing is feeling on any given day. So we spend a lot of time with the foreign media here in Hong Kong, and a lot of these conversations, Angie, that I talked about earlier, that we are having within our own newsroom, we're also having with our international and global counterparts that are based in the city. Listen, the evidence is that those international news organizations should still be able to operate as is in Hong Kong at this moment in time. But you can imagine that a lot of news organizations are trying to mitigate their risk. There has already been, the New York Times, as an example, has made a big deal about moving part of their operation to Seoul. And then there are others who have been planning contingency plans. And whether or not they actually trigger those, we'll see. I hope that it doesn't happen. I should say that. I hope it doesn't happen. I think that, as you well know, because you know Hong Kong so well, and you know what it means for global media covering Asia to be based out of the city. It's a great city to report from. It remains a great city to report from. And frankly, honestly, the tenor of reporting about China and the convenience of reporting about the rest of Asia changes if the global media base moves away from Hong Kong. And like I said earlier, I think that the world will suffer for it, not just this city. So, so yes, again, I don't fault any news organization for making plans. And I certainly do hope that the government here in Hong Kong recognizes that this could be a threat if international news organizations start pulling out en masse. This could be a threat to the international reputation of Hong Kong, to the importance of this city for the entire region, and that they themselves, the government, will also take the necessary steps to mitigate those risks. Because I think that the actual action of leaving is primarily out of the fear of the unknown, as opposed to the practical, like the reality of the present. And so the government can do something to change that perception. That's my.
Which government are you talking about, though? Hong Kong or Beijing?
I mean, I'm talking about Hong Kong. Beijing, even with the national security law, has stayed very, very quiet. That is the way they operate in the city, and we should expect with the national security law they continue to do so. They may now operate much more, how should I say, much more apparently in action, but they will still not speak a lot, and it will still be the Hong Kong government that speaks. And I do think that what they say matters, right? And so we've written plenty of editorials and published plenty of opinions saying that there has to be a balance in the way that things are actioned here in Hong Kong and the things that the government says. One of the things that we are very disturbed by, and we will continue to speak out about, is the fact that the police feel like if they have the authority now to define who a journalist is, the more that the police go down a path like this, the more the fear of the unknown is going to grip the industry here, which means that news organizations are going to continue down this path of risk mitigation. And that's terrible for the city. And so those are the kinds of things that the Hong Kong government can actually do something about. Whether or not they're going to, I don't know.
Thank you, Gary. This question from the audience for Robert. How much, in your view, has American influence in the region declined, and what does it need to do to bolster its soft and hard power?
Well, I would say the degree to which American influence in the region has declined, and by the region, I assume we're talking about the Asia Pacific region. And so if that's the case, sitting in Washington, it's hard to know because I'm not in Asia, but I do sense from a lot of the communications that we get from the State Department, I would say the State Department in particular, about how much, let's say, for example, amid the coronavirus pandemic, there's a lot of messaging about how much the State Department is doing for the region, how much they want to engage in the region, and how much they want to support the region in terms of in terms of whether it's medicine or whether it's PPE or whether it's expertise, which of course is a bizarre thing to hear when you see how the pandemic is so out of control in the U.S. But I do sense that there's a lot of effort to really push that message not only to the audiences overseas in the region. What needs to be done? I mean, in my opinion, what needs to be done is that there needs to be a more of a re-engagement with America's allies. Whether that is in the offing, it's hard to know. But in general, I do sense that there is a lot of concern within the government about how much influence they have in the region, the U.S. government has in the region, and where that is going. And I think they're responding to it. Whether or not this is coming all the way down from President Trump, I'm not sure. But there are certainly, I sense a lot of people within the bureaucracy of the State Department that are very concerned about this, and that's why they message that way.
Thank you. This question for Ling Ling pre-submitted from the audience ahead of this panel. How does the journalism environment compare with that in mainland China for international journalists, which poses a greater risk of legal punishment? I'll put that into context a little bit. We obviously are monitoring the story of Australian journalist Cheng Lei, who was really the face of China's English news service CCTV. She has been detained and her profile interviews were wiped from CGTN's website, and she's now being currently held under residential surveillance in an unknown location. That was the latest headline back last month. These are just examples. And then in Hong Kong, an RTHK reporter is on permanent leave as a result of some of her very sharp questions that has been reported by SCMP. So Ling Ling, what is the environment in mainland China for international journalists? Do you think that that has shifted as U.S.-China relations have chilled? Ling Ling, unmute yourself.
Sorry
Great.
about that. Yeah, definitely a yes to that question. The environment for international journalists in mainland China definitely has shifted, and for the worse, has got a lot tighter. As evidenced by the expulsions of all those American journalists out of China since early this year. I think more than a dozen also American journalists for the Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post. The context you provided was very helpful because he talked about basically there are two. One of the cases I'm not very familiar with the other case you talked about, but the Australian journalist case I've read about it. I don't know any detail about what exactly she was detained for, but her case just shows, she's the Australian citizen, but she's ethnic Chinese, right? She grew up in China and actually worked for a government-owned media outlet in Beijing. So her case is very mysterious. And so, I don't want to comment on that because I seriously do not know any ins and outs of that. But it just reminds me, yes, the environment for international journalists have got a lot tighter, but even worse, if you're Chinese, ethnic Chinese, or Chinese nationals working for international media outlets in China, some of my colleagues, and I'm sure there are probably Chinese reporters with what we call researchers, because the Chinese government doesn't allow Chinese nationals to have bylines in international newspapers. So places like the Wall Street Journal, the Times, the Post, we all have very excellent Chinese national researchers. They're just as good as reporters. The only difference is that they can't get byline. So since early this year, a lot of those researchers, they were pressured very hard. For people like me, I have a blue passport. I still had a choice. The choice I made was packing up, come back to New York and continue to write about China. But those Chinese nationals, they didn't have that choice. They have to remain in China. So you can imagine that kind of pressure on those people. Excellent reporters, excellent journalists. That's just too bad, especially at a time when China needs the world to understand it better, right? But now, because all those journalists are getting kicked out, or their life is in limbo because they do not know what's going to happen next day. So obviously that would hurt the quality of information coming out of China. Despite the fact that I know there's still excellent journalists like those working for Gary, day in and day out, filing excellent stories out of China, but still, there's just one news organization there, and there's so many others. Their reporters either getting kicked out or their life in limbo. Would they decide to remain in China because they don't know if they have families? Then next year, their visa not getting renewed, the whole family would be uprooted and God knows where. So I think that really hurts the very thing that China is trying to do here, is trying to the whole world to understand China better. But by kicking out journalists, it's really not in China's interest.
Yeah, let me add a little bit to that. I fully agree with what Ling Ling is saying. A lot of people ask us, whether or not it provides a great opportunity for South China Morning Post that a lot of our global peers have been effectively expelled, I mean, practically expelled from mainland China. And our answer is always, no, this is not a good thing, right? It's not only that whenever one journalist gets expelled from China, everyone else gets squeezed, right? Even though the South China Morning Post still exists in China, we still have our bureaus in 4 different major cities. We still at any point in time have about 70 people reporting on the ground in China, in mainland China. It's still, the restrictive environment affects all of us. But beyond that, we don't want to be the only player in mainland China because China's too big, it's too complicated, it's too nuanced. One news organization cannot properly cover China for the world. And so when we are just on our own, we know that we're not going to be able to get to everything. We're going to try our darnest, right? But we don't want there to be a situation where we're the only player. And Ling Ling is right. Of course, you know, we have incredibly brave and amazing colleagues that are in mainland China that are PRC citizens. We actually do give them, by their choice, bylines, which makes us very, very unique among the press corps in mainland China. A lot of our colleagues that are PRC citizens that are working in mainland China, that don't have the option of leaving, they have bylines. And that is by their choice. And they continue to use bylines because they believe it is important to put their name against what they're writing for the world to see. But yes, the situation is always fluctuating. Now, granted, it is not new, but again, we have started to see contraction and we have to go back to a playbook of how to make sure that we are able to get to the right sources, the right information, and the right level of transparency in a more difficult environment. There's one clarification that I do need to make because we've kind of been dancing around this a lot during the entire panel. What Ling Ling is describing and what's going on in mainland China and her experience in mainland China and the fact that journalists have become, as you put it, Angie, cannon fodder in the rising political tensions between the two countries is different here in Hong Kong. It's not, we cannot apply that same situation and that same reality to what's happening here in Hong Kong because it's not the same. Journalists, by and large, are not cannon fodder because of Beijing, Washington, relational issues, right? That's not what's happening here in Hong Kong. The restrictions, the increased difficulty of reporting in mainland China, the expulsion of foreign journalists from mainland China is not being replicated, certainly not at this moment, in Hong Kong. And again, fingers crossed, our expectation, there's no indication that it's going to be replicated here in Hong Kong. So that we have to keep very separate. It increases the importance of Hong Kong as a base, right?
Gary,
because,
I just want to jump in. Then I want you to address 2 things that have happened. And then, if we're gonna, and just to be completely transparent and clear, I use the word cannon fodder, and obviously because of what we're seeing, but in Hong Kong, there's 2 things that we've seen, which is the visas, as you've said, have slowed down. Some have been rejected. By some, I think there was one very clear case, but some retroactively where we saw expulsion of journalists after connection to some very, politically sensitive issues, one at the FCC. So that's one. And then number 2 is the press corps, the being allowed to cover the protests if you do not have an accredited press badge. And one that was issued by the Hong Kong Journalists Association is no longer recognized. Those 2 things very clearly have happened this past year. So just to incept that and just to be clear about what's happening in Hong Kong, don't you see a degradation a little bit?
I think that there are things that we have to be clearly worried about the state of press in Hong Kong and the ability for journalists to continue operating as we've operated here for a long time. So don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting the national security law has no implications and no impact here in Hong Kong, but I just wanted to be clear that a lot of the impact of US-China tensions and the way that it's played out against journalists, by the way, in both places, right, both in the United States and in China, that is not something that we can't just paint with that broad stroke when we're talking about the Hong Kong press and the Hong Kong press situation. The situation that you're talking about, and again, these details matter, Angie. When it comes to the press accreditation, this is right now a police rule. They've decided that for certain things, especially official police press conferences, they're going to allow, they have decided that they're going to allow certain journalists and keep certain journalists out. That we think is a massive issue. But that did not stop journalists, and this came after the national security law. This was just a couple of weeks old, right? This new development. This had nothing to do with the protest. Well, at the very least, this did not impact anyone's ability to report on the protest last year, right? And that is something that Keith and the journalism schools, South China Morning Post, and our newspaper peers, as well as journalist organizations in Hong Kong, are going to continue to fight against, because we don't think that is right, and we're very, very vocal about it not being right. As for the visa issue, the specific issue that you're, I think, referring to was one of these foreign journalists that was expelled from mainland China tried to come to Hong Kong to make Hong Kong their new base. And again, not surprisingly, they were not able to get a visa that normally and under normal situations, they would have been able to get. But that was post-expulsion from mainland China. Again, I'm not suggesting that it is not a bad thing for Hong Kong, of course. Of course, there is impact. But I just want to warn that we can't just paint a broad stroke and say whatever is happening with foreign journalists and journalism in mainland China is the same as here in Hong Kong, because those still remain two vastly different worlds.
Yeah. Angie, can I mention something here? Which is the biggest concern is that the national security law itself, when you read it, it actually mentions the need to strengthen what they call supervision of the foreign media. It's written in the law. Yeah, so they see the foreign press in Hong Kong as something that needs to be supervised, and I see these visa delays for a lot of journalists from New York Times, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, others in Hong Kong as part of this idea of increased scrutiny, and that's why the New York Times is moving many of its people. They said 1/3, it may be more than that, to Seoul. Because when you start having these kind of lengthy visa delays, sometimes the journalists are already here, but they have to have their visas renewed, but they're not allowed to work during this lengthy delay visa of the renewal, so they end up leaving. And so, I think there is a tightening of journalists who want to come here in the future, because they're starting to move more towards, I'm not saying they are a mainland type Chinese visa regime, but they're starting to move more towards that, where they're using the visa as kind of leverage. And just one other quick thing, if you just got 1 minute, from the time, I was going a lot into China in the 1990s. When I lived in Hong Kong, I was covering going in and out of China. I lived in China from the end of 2009 through 2013. During that, for the Washington Post, all of that, during that period, I would say the Chinese foreign ministry, the Chinese government, they didn't like the foreign press, but they thought they needed us. They were constantly telling me in lunches and dinners with the foreign ministry, saying, why doesn't the Washington Post put more journalists in China? China's a big country. We really think you should have more journalists in China. There was this period, after Tiananmen Square, right, the massacre of Tiananmen Square in 1989, they only kicked out 2 journalists after that. They wanted the foreign journalists there as kind of affirmation that China was, was okay, that things were back to normal. During the period of the Olympics, they wanted the foreign journalists there. Every time there was one of these National People's Congress meetings, and I would go attend things, all the Chinese government TV channels would turn the cameras around and film me, so they could say, look, the foreign press is here. We're an important country. We're a superpower. I think the big change in China now is they no longer think they need the foreign press. They now think, okay, we don't need all these journalists here anymore. We don't need them for affirmation. So I think that's been the huge change in China now. They no longer need all these foreign reporters here to say, we're being covered because we're a big country.
Thank you for that. I wonder as well, especially Gary and Keith, you both have mainland Chinese journalism students, in your case, Keith, and incredible researchers and reporters sitting alongside, the expat, the foreign journalists who are here in the newsroom and also in your classrooms. Do you see the political divide color some of the internal either office culture or class culture where you're both at?
I'll be very frank. I don't think the political divide is just because there are expat journalists and local journalists. I think that it is just across the board. People have their own personal opinions. You have to understand that the changes that are happening here in Hong Kong are so deeply personal to our Hong Kong journalists, right? And a big chunk of our newsroom and our overall company, of course, are still, these are local Hong Kong people. And this is their home. This will continue to remain their home for the rest of their lives, and they care deeply about this place. And there's definitely differences in opinions. But to Ling Ling's point, should those opinions ever make their way into the news? The answer, of course, is no. And so much of our editors' time and energy right now is to make sure that, that when we enter into the newsroom, when our people come back and follow a story, that they recognize that they represent the South China Morning Post, which is objective news, that they need to, we're reporting fact and truth for the rest of the world without favor and without fear. And that's the way we're going to do it. Now, there's a lot of discussion, and this is a newsroom that prides itself on debate. We probably should be having more debate than we do today, but that I think is true of most newsrooms around the world. And COVID-19 and being distributed has not helped create environments for that kind of healthy debate. But that's something that I know our newsroom leaders are very, very dedicated to. So the difference in opinion, not just Western journalists versus local journalists, it can be cut across any lines because it is definitely more polarizing. People have stronger opinions about everything, not unique to Hong Kong. But does it affect our news? No, it should never. And we should continue to debate.
And frankly, it's not unique to journalists. It's a professional hazard. We all have very strong personalities, right? And that's just the nature of the beast. Keith?
So I was just about to say, same in the classroom. We have people from mainland, people from Hong Kong. At the height of the protest last year, which was November or so, I was teaching a feature writing class. So I just tore up the syllabus that I had planned and just told everybody, why don't you, if you want to, write a personal first-person essay about what the protest have meant to you. And it was amazing. Some of the Hong Kong students writing about, we're not sure we're going to be able to stay here. The mainland students, they were writing things. Some of them said they left. They fled. They thought it was too scary to be in Hong Kong. Others said, no, I decided to stay and talk to the protesters because I wanted to understand better why people in Hong Kong were protesting. And so, I kind of used it as a cathartic experience to get people to actually write about the experiences. And again, I mean, we have that same diversity of viewpoints that Gary was talking about in the classroom. But I think, once you get mainland students here talking to Hong Kong people and they start understanding better why they're protesting, and you get Hong Kong people who actually meet mainland students and they realize, they're not all a bunch of brainwashed robots there who follow, who felt, the fact that they came to Hong Kong to study journalism puts them in a different category, right away. But if those kinds of conversations we have in our classrooms could go on at a wider scale, that'd be fantastic.
Last question, and we got to wrap this up in 1 minute. So just very quickly, 30 seconds from each of you. Who do you think, which organization do you think is doing it well in the Asia Pacific region? What's the future for journalism in this region? What are your hopes? Ling Ling, I'll start with you. 30 seconds,
Sure.
And then we'll go round circle.
Sure. In a healthy society, journalists should be able to do their jobs without being afraid of offending anyone. Hong Kong has been such a society for a long time. My sincere hope is that it will remain that way.
Thank you. Robert?
I just feel like Ling Ling said it so well. I have a very personal attachment to Hong Kong, and one thing I noticed that impresses me is that I think there still is a lot of good journalism that comes out of Hong Kong, not only from the South China Morning Post, but also other media outlets, especially through the local outlets. So I hope that continues.
Thank you. Keith?
In terms of who's doing a great job, I mean, obviously SCMP because they're here in the space, but one of the things that excites me about the future are these new online digital sites that are popping along. I mean, like Rappler in the Philippines, Malaysia Kini, in Malaysia, in Myanmar, there are some going on. In China itself, you've got Six Tone and, and you've got a lot of really interesting online sites that are coming, some with niche markets, some that are covering things broadly. And I think that's kind of going to be the future that I'm looking at more closely and looking really excited about.
Well, that's a personal bet I've made as well. Thank you, Keith.
I didn't mention yours. I could have given you a free plug.
Gary, thank you.
I think everyone who's reporting in Asia right now is trying their hardest and producing incredible journalism. So you can't really pick. I mean, there's just such great journalism coming out of this part of the world, and people should be paying attention to it. I think crisis creates incredible journalism, and I have a huge amount of hope for the next generation of journalists from Asia. And as I said, I think the world needs to pay even closer attention.
Thank you all to our esteemed panelists and for this very engaging conversation. I think sometimes we think that ignorance is bliss, but I think ignorance masks the fear. It is our role as journalists to unmask that ignorance and to be the light. It's important. So thank you to all of you for this incredible conversation. Gary and Keith, what a great fireside chat to kick things off with. And Susan, back to you.
Wow. That was a terrific program, and I don't want to end it. And I'm sure the viewers don't want it to end either. Thank you so much to our speakers for their candid discussion. And I think programs like this always make me realize, and I hope all of our viewers realize, how really tough and challenging journalists around the world, their jobs are. It's always been a hard job, but now we've got the new challenges of national security law, pandemic, legal challenges to put journalists away. We've got outrageous social media disinformation campaigns, and the list goes on, shrinking public in trust in data and facts. So the job is really hard, and I thank you all. I thank journalists around the world, but I thank you all for your wonderful comments. Gary, Keith, Robert, Ling Ling, Angie, you did a terrific job of moderating. So thanks to our viewers, and thanks to the South China Morning Post for being our partner. And now just a very quick thing to end this. We're hoping that you will tune in for our next EWC Seminars Live. We're going to be talking about, this is on October 27, Hawaii, October 28 in Asia. Academics and Asian journalists are going to be talking about Asian perspectives on future relations as America votes. You know, there's citizen governments in Asia who are eager for insights on what that election result is going to bring for relationships to their countries. And we feel there's a sense in the region that perhaps as much in the United States that the U.S. faces a critical moment. So please tune in. Check us out at www.eastwestcenter.org/-EWC Seminars Live for details of registration. And the South China Morning Post also invites you to sign up for its Global Impact newsletter at sc.mp/Global Impact, which is a bi-weekly e-newsletter curated by its journalists that explores the impact of emerging topics originating from China and their significance around the globe. So the discussions go on. Thank you again to all of our wonderful speakers and to our audience. Aloha from Hawaii. Thank you. Bye-bye.